You are welcome to yet another episode of HN What's Your Say? The #1 listening show, where we discuss real issues with real people like you. We are still featuring R. Kelly. Real name Robert Sylvester Kelly. Also known as the R&B King. When examining the legal landscape of R. Kelly's Chicago conviction, one issue stands out as so clear, so straightforward and so rooted in long-standing principles of American law that it begs a deeper look. And that is the statutes of limitations. This is not just a technicality. It's a fundamental protection built into our justice system to ensure fairness, due process and finality. And when it comes to R. Kelly, this issue was blatantly ignored or conveniently brushed aside by a system that seems more interested in punishing a man than upholding the law. This legal doctrine exists for a reason. It sets a maximum time after an event within which legal proceedings may be initiated. Once that time has passed, a person cannot be prosecuted or sued for that specific act. Why? Because over time, memories fade, evidence is lost, witnesses disappear and the possibility of a fair trial diminishes. It's not just a technicality. It's a safeguard against injustice. In the case of R. Kelly, the government's charges included allegations that dated back decades. Some going as far back as the 1990s and early 2000s. But here's the catch: at the time those alleged acts took place, there were statutes of limitations in Illinois and under federal law that imposed clear deadlines for prosecution. Those deadlines came and went. The time expired. The clock ran out. And that should have been the end of it. R. Kelly, like any other American citizen, is entitled to the protections that come with those expiration dates. In fact, we can be sure there are individuals who benefited from these very same protections back then, except R. Kelly, who is being blatantly prejudiced by the system. The government should have never been allowed to file charges based on claims that were legally stale. Claims that by law should have been time-barred. But instead of following the letter of the law, what did the prosecutors do? They leaned on a statutory amendment. Changes to the law that were made years later, as far as the year 2003. The government's position is that because the statute of limitations was eventually removed or extended for certain offenses, they were now free to reach back into the past and prosecute decades-old allegations. In other words, they argue that the rules changed and therefore they could bypass the old expiration dates. But this argument defies one of the most basic rules in our legal system: laws are not supposed to be retroactive unless Congress or the legislature explicitly says so, and even then, retroactive criminal laws are strictly disallowed by the Constitution. The ex post facto clause of the U.S. Constitution forbids the government from criminalizing actions that were not illegal at the time they were committed or from increasing the penalties for past acts after the fact. This same logic applies to statutes of limitations. You cannot change the deadline after the act being prosecuted. You can't revive a dead claim unless the law explicitly says you can, and even then, courts usually tread very carefully, especially when someone's liberty is at stake. The courts know this. Every first-year law student knows this. And certainly, the appeal court judges in Chicago knew this as well. And yet they upheld R. Kelly's 20-year sentence without even properly reckoning with the fact that many of the charges were built on allegations that were already expired by law. This isn't just about whether someone believes R. Kelly is guilty or innocent. This is about whether the law is applied fairly or equally to every citizen. Because if we allow the government to rewrite the rules after the fact, to pursue criminal charges long after the legal deadline, then no one is safe from being prosecuted for ancient claims, no matter how old or unverifiable. R. Kelly's defense team rightly pointed this out in their appeal. They argued plainly and logically that even if the government wanted to pursue these charges, they were bound by the statutes of limitations as they existed at the time the alleged acts occurred. The law doesn't allow prosecutors to wake up 20 or 30 years later, dust off old accusations and treat them as if they're fresh just because the law has changed since then. This is why we don't see government collecting new taxes from old transactions. And here's what's so striking. This is not a controversial argument. It's not obscure. It's so basic. It's something any fair-minded person can understand without needing a law degree. If you break a rule today, you face consequences based on the rules that exist today and not the ones that will be written tomorrow. And the same goes in reverse. If you did something decades ago and the law said the government had 5 years to charge you, and they didn't, that's it. Game over. No amount of moral outrage, no cultural narrative, no media pressure should allow prosecutors or judges to bend that rule. Because once they do it to one man, once they do it to R. Kelly, then they can do it to anyone else. And that's why this part of his defense is so important. It speaks not just to his rights, but to the rights of every citizen under the Constitution. Now let's take a closer look at how this unfolded in practice. Many of the alleged acts in R. Kelly's Chicago conviction were said to have occurred more than 20 years ago. At the time, the statutes of limitations were crystal clear. For example, in many cases of alleged misconduct, the government had 5 years from the time of the offense to file charges. 5 years. Not 10. Not 20 but 5. The other condition was until the alleged victims turned 25 years of age. And yet the charges weren't brought until 2019, far beyond that deadline and after all the purported victims had already turned 25. So what did the government do? They tried to breathe life into these claims by pointing to a statutory amendment of 2003 that eliminated or extended the statute of limitations for certain offenses. But again, that change came long after the alleged act. And by virtue of the ex post facto clause, the law that should be followed is the one that existed at the time of the alleged act. The courts are not supposed to apply such changes retroactively. In fact, Article 1, Clause 9 of the U.S. Constitution bars Congress from enacting retroactive laws or amendments. In Kelly's case, there was no carve-out allowing the government to go back in time and revive old claims that had been dead for years. In fact, applying the amended statute retroactively to R. Kelly violates deeply rooted legal doctrines. Ones that are essential to the American legal tradition. And yet, despite all this, the appeal court in Chicago chose to uphold the conviction and the 20-year sentence. They did this in full view of a blatant violation of the statute of limitations. But why would they do this? Some might argue it's politics. Some might say it's bias. But whatever the reason, the bottom line is this: it's legally indefensible. Even if the appeal judges were determined to uphold the sentence, even if they felt pressure to rule a certain way, this was one area where the law was so plainly on the defense's side that any reasonable court would have been hard-pressed to ignore it unless they simply chose to. And that's what makes this part of R. Kelly's appeal so powerful. It's not a complicated argument. It's not based on murky facts or disputed evidence. It's based on the law. Cold, hard, undeniable law. And when the law is ignored in such a brazen manner, it raises serious questions about the integrity of the entire judicial process. Let us be clear, statutes of limitations exist for a reason. They are not optional. They are not flexible. They are not to be brushed aside in the name of convenience or public pressure. They are foundational to a system that values fairness, accountability, and due process. R. Kelly, regardless of anyone's opinion about him personally, deserved the protection of those legal safeguards. He deserved a court that would recognize the legal limits of the prosecution's power. He deserved a fair shot, and not just in theory but in practice. By ignoring the expired statutes of limitations, the government effectively reached into the past and dragged forward claims that had no legal standing. The court's job was to say no in order to draw the line and uphold the law. But instead, they let the floodgates open, allowing a prosecution based on events long outside the statute of limitations. And that, quite frankly, should trouble every American. If we say this is okay in this case, then what's to stop it from happening in the next? The statutes of limitations argument in R. Kelly's Chicago appeal was perhaps the most straightforward and most legally sound defense point raised. It didn't require sympathy. It didn't require belief in his innocence. It only required a basic respect for the rule of law and a commitment to applying it equally. And while the court may have upheld the sentence, it did so by turning its back on one of the most essential principles of justice: that there must be an end to legal exposure, that deadlines matter, and that no one, no matter how unpopular, should be prosecuted outside of the time the law permits. That's the truth the court chose to ignore. But it's the truth we must continue to speak. That is all we had for you today on HN What's Your Say? To keep updated whenever we post a new video, subscribe to this channel now. Also remember to hit the bell icon and enable notifications. And feel free to share your opinions with us in the comment section below, and let us know if you would like us to publish your views in our next release. We value all our subscribers' opinions.